So, in this video, we take up for discussion The Zoo Story by Edward Albee, some of the questions and their answers for the purpose of examination. First, let's take up an essay question. This is the question. Discuss Edward Albee's The Zoo Story as an absurd play. Well, I have prepared the essay in 4 paragraphs. Paragraph number 1, that's the introduction. The Zoo Story is a one-act play by Edward Albee. It is an absurd play. So, it deviates from the conventional elements of drama. So when we watch this play, do not prepare yourself to watch a conventional play. This is a completely different drama, because you wouldn't find the conventional system of the plot development and the characterization in this absurd play, because this is an absurd play. And its themes, it explores themes such as, number 1, isolation; number 2, loneliness; 3, lack of communication; 4, social disparity; and finally, dehumanization in an artificial, materialistic American society. So this would be a brief introduction. The play revolves around 2 characters. We know the 2 characters, don't we? Peter and Jerry, who meet. Where do they meet? On a park bench in Central Park in New York City. Peter is an upper middle class family man in his mid-40s. He is a wealthy publishing executive with a wife, 2 daughters, 2 cats, and 2 parakeets. Whereas Jerry is an isolated and disheartened man. Well, he is desperate to have a meaningful conversation with another human being. He is trying to find another human being to have a conversation, to have a social intercourse. He intrudes. Well, he intrudes. It is not a friendly way of approaching a man. Intrudes on Peter's peaceful state. We know what Peter was doing. Peter was reading a book alone on a bench. Intrudes on Peter's peaceful state by questioning him, interrogating him, and forcing him to listen to stories about his life and the reason behind his visit to the zoo. He says, "I have been to the zoo, mister. I have been to the zoo." Jerry tells Peter about his ugly and stupid landlady and her dog. Jerry tried to befriend the dog, but the dog responded only by attacking him. Then Jerry decided to kill the dog by feeding the dog with a poisoned hamburger. Although this sickened the dog became sick, but it was not killed. It eventually recovered and began to simply leave him alone. So the dog was indifferent, and he was also indifferent towards the dog. Paragraph number 3. Peter has had enough of this strange companion, and he tries to leave. Well, he's fed up. He tries to bid goodbye, say goodbye to him. But Jerry tries to force Peter to move from the bench, and he punches him. Jerry punches him, pushes him, punches him. He punches him and he refuses. Unexpectedly, Jerry pulls out a knife on Peter, and then drops it. He tosses it. He drops it for Peter to grab. When Peter holds the knife defensively, well, in self-defense, because he was afraid, a little bit afraid, he was holding the knife In self-defense, Jerry charges him and impales himself, hurts himself on the knife. Naturally, Jerry is hurt, bleeding on the park bench. Jerry finishes his zoo story. He completes his zoo story by bringing it into the immediate present. He, says, he calls out, "Could I have planned all this? No, I couldn't have. But I think I did." Well, these are, the last words of Jerry. Peter runs away. He's afraid. He was frightened. He runs for his life. He runs away from Jerry, whose dying words, "Oh my God." These are the dying words. These are the last words of the play. Well, this is the summary of the story. And then you can add a comment. How does the play become an absurd play? Well, here it is. So you try to say what an absurd play is and how the qualities of the absurd play are applied in this play. That would be the last paragraph, the concluding paragraph. The Zoo Story is an absurd play. It's an absurd play. And hence, for the same reason, it deviates from the conventional drama. It emphasizes the existentialist philosophy of the absurdity and the meaninglessness of human existence. The attempts to show that life is essentially meaningless and hence miserable. There is no hope because of the inevitable futility of men's efforts. Man is fascinated by death, which permanently replaces dreams and illusions. Well, there is no action in this play. You wouldn't find, a properly developed action, a plot. No. Very little happens. Nothing happens because we can see that in the play. Peter, Jerry. Jerry says a few things and then the play comes to an end. Well, very little happens because nothing meaningful can happen in life. That's it. In Zoo Story, the main point is the lack of contact between human beings. For example, the apathy, the indifference, self-destructiveness, and cruelty. And the whole action is in the form of a paradox conversation between them, between Peter and Jerry, until it culminates, the climax, it culminates in the death of Jerry. Well, this is an essay in 4 paragraphs. Let's come to the short answer questions. Short answer question number 1. Where does the play take place? We know it takes place in Central Park in the New York City. Who are the central characters in the play? Well, there are 2, Peter and Jerry. Peter is a clean-cut upper middle-class man. He's in his early 40s. Whereas Jerry is a lower middle-class man, carelessly dressed in his 30s, late 30s. Question number 3. Why did Peter come to the park? He comes with a book. He reads. That's it. Peter came to the park to spend his Sunday afternoon. He would occupy the same bench and read till evening because it was a very, very secluded place there. Question number 4. What do you know about the family and the profession of Peter? Well, family, we know. Peter is a regular American, a successful business executive with the publishing industry. He says he works in a publishing firm. They publish textbooks. He lives a settled life in an upper middle class locality with his wife, 2 daughters, 2 cats, and a pair of parakeets. Where does Jerry live? Jerry lives in a tiny run-down apartment, a dilapidated old apartment, on the upper west side of the New York City, between Columbus Avenue and Central Park West. Why did Jerry go to the zoo? Well, he says, to find out more about the way people exist with animals and the way animals exist with each other. This is the reason that he says. He wanted to find out, do a research to find out why, to find out how the animals exist with the human beings exist with man, and the animals exist with each other. But he couldn't find it out because they were separated by cages. They were put in a cage. What makes the dog strike a peace deal with Jerry? Jerry tried to befriend the dog by feeding it with hamburger for many days, but his attempts failed. So he tried to poison the dog, but the dog survived it and learned to live with Jerry without attacking him anymore. Question number 8. What makes the landlady of Jerry thoroughly loathsome? Oh, very hateful, very loathsome. You wouldn't want to love her. You would love to hate her. The landlady is a drunken, idiotic woman with a disgusting smell of body and breath. Very bad smell. She constantly tries to seduce Jerry, but he escapes. This is what makes her thoroughly loathsome. What causes the physical fight between Peter and Jerry? Well, Jerry wants Peter to move over, but Peter refuses to do so because he does not want to give up his bench. This is what causes the physical fight between Peter and Jerry. What happens to Jerry at the end of the play? We know, don't we? At the end of the play, Jerry completes his dog story and encroaches Peter's space on the bench. He pushes him off the bench. He also tries to get him to fight, produces a knife, charges at Peter, and he impales himself. He hurts himself in his abdomen, in his belly. Finally, Jerry dies. Question number 11. What does Jerry ask Peter to do before he dies? Well, he tells him to don't forget to take your book. That's what he says. Before he dies, Jerry reminds Peter not to forget his book. Peter takes the book and runs away, dashes off as Jerry dies. What does the zoo symbolize? The zoo. The zoo constitutes the central symbol of the play. It symbolizes human isolation and the absence of contact and communication. The zoo story is concerned with human isolation. So these are the short answer questions. Now the paragraph questions. Question number 1. Comment on the character of Peter. Well, you can have, you can write a paragraph about the character of Peter and the character of Jerry, or you can compare and contrast the two characters. Peter is a regular American, a successful business executive with a small publishing house. He lives a settled life in an upper middle class locality. He has a wife, 2 daughters, 2 cats, and a pair of parakeets. Peter leads a structured life, a very systematic life. He spends his Sunday afternoons on a bench in the Central Park in New York. What does he do there? He reads. He reads till evening. Peter represents the urban middle class with their values of privacy, decency, polite manners, and detachment. Well, upper middle class. No contact with society. He does not seem to bother much about what goes on around him. He is unaffected by the happenings around. His comments about his favorite books. He says, Jerry asks him about his favorite writers, Baudelaire. he have more than having strong opinions. Well, he doesn't have any strong opinions about the things that are happening around him. He's very, very diplomatic. He tries to evade questions. Paragraph question number 2. Contrast the character of Jerry with that of Peter. How different is Jerry from Peter? Peter and Jerry have complex, fully realized personalities. Peter is a level-headed, polite, and compassionate. He is a somewhat shallow, not deep. He is a somewhat shallow thinker, not a deep thinker, not a deep thinking man. He does not seem to analyze much of what goes on around him. His comments about his favorite books show that he values being diplomatic more than having strong opinions. He doesn't have strong opinions about the things that happen around him. Jerry, on the other hand, spends most of his energy analyzing the world around him. Well, he has a lot of time for himself. So he spends much of his time in observing the world around him. His opinions are not conventional, unconventional, and he is very eager to share his ideas them with his Peter. Although the two men do not seem to share many personality traits, they have very, very little in common. They do have certain qualities in common. And what are they? Both of them, seem to be unsatisfied with their lives. Peter is not happy with his life, is he? Otherwise he wouldn't be here, alone, in the park. He would come to the park. He would go to the park with his family, but he is alone. And both of them seem to be unsatisfied with their home lives. Both seem to feel alienated, a sense of alienation, and misunderstood by society. Question number 3. What is the relevance of the dog's story? Jerry talks about, he gives a long story of the dog, the landlady's dog. First he tried to love him, then he tried to poison him, then, well, they were indifferent to each other. A long story. That's sum and substance of the story. The dog's story plays a very important role in the play. Jerry narrates how he learns to live with his landlady's thankless dog. Why thankless? Because he tried to feed the dog, but in return, the dog tried to bite him. He tried to befriend the dog with the hamburgers for many days, failing which, what happened? He tried to poison the dog, but the dog survives, but learns to live with Jerry without attacking him anymore. This is what happens at the end of the story. The story of the dog shocks Peter, and he is unwilling to listen further to the Jerry. He says, enough, I don't want to listen more about that. The lack of communication must be the result of the class difference, because one belongs to the upper middle class, the other one, Jerry, belongs to the lower middle class. The class difference and the widely different upbringing, the way they were brought up, and the outlooks of the two men. Well, Jerry sees animals as a potential solution. As far as Jerry is concerned, Jerry takes this story, or dog, the animal, because the title, remember, the zoo story. He takes the animal as a potential solution to his feelings of loneliness and alienation. Well, he can start loving. He can start having friendship with men with the dog, beginning with the dog. He has trouble in establishing, forging relationships with other humans. He believes that he can solve this problem by learning to interact with animals. Question number 4. Comment on the social and economic background of the major characters, Peter and Jerry, of the play. Peter and Jerry belong to different social economic classes in American society. One is upper middle class and the other one is lower middle class. Peter enjoys a high salary and a stable family life. Jerry has no job, and he characterizes himself as a permanent Transient is temporary. This difference is not just a matter of how much money the men have. No, not only that, the difference doesn't stop there. It affects everything from their philosophical viewpoints to the way they perceive the world. Their life so far has been so radically different, entirely different. So they do not share common experiences. As a result, they have trouble understanding each other. It is these social class distinctions that bring about the tragedy of the play. Question number 5. This is the last paragraph question. Well, Peter and Jerry, this is the question. Can the play be viewed as the friction and lack of communication between the classes? Lack of communication. There is no communication between the upper middle class and the lower middle class. Can this play be viewed as this? Well, Peter and Jerry are unable to bridge their differences to achieve any real communication. This communication failure occurs both on linguistic and philosophical levels, at 2 levels. The communication failure. One, linguistic, language, because Jerry doesn't understand what Peter says, and Peter doesn't understand what Jerry says. This is linguistic. It's on 2 levels: linguistic, language level, and philosophical level. On the linguistic level, take for example the language. The men have trouble conversing, communicating, talking, because they have different understandings of the world and concepts, because their viewpoints, their understanding of the world is completely different. For example, when Peter tells Jerry that he has 2 daughters, Peter says, I have 2 daughters. Peter assumes that this communicates that he is married. Peter believes that, Peter assumes this communicates that he is married. Now, as far as Jerry is concerned, no, it is not. It is something else. However, Jerry does not make this assumption. He doesn't take it as, that he is married. Is something else. Peter, there is also a deeper failure to communicate on a philosophical level. What is it? Their opinions about life, their views of life, and its meaning are completely different, and what makes it difficult for them to connect with each other. Well, ultimately, the play's tragedy results from the fact that Jerry will never find a way to communicate with the world that considers him an outsider. So, as far as Jerry is concerned, the entire world, the world considers him as an outsider. He has nothing to do with the world, no relations with human beings. There is total alienation, isolation. He is completely alone. He does not belong to anywhere. That's it. A rootlessness. That's it. This is, the feature of the absurd play. So I think that's it. Thank you very much.